What's going on? Welcome to the Blue Shoes Fitness Podcast, where we talk about strength training, nutrition, faith, family, and how all of those things work together for parents like you and me. My name is Coach Jay, and today we're going to talk about some basic nutrition terms that you'll likely come across on food labels, social media, and all types of food marketing. And some of these terms are going to be super important for you and your goals, while I'm going to recommend that you totally disregard some of the others. And the point of this episode is to help you to know the difference so that you can feel better educated the next time you're at the store deciding which foods to buy. Before we get into that, let's kick things off with our verse of the week. And I'm going to be reading out of 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. This is where I am doing my own personal Bible study, and I came across this earlier this week. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ! Exclamation point. You don't see a whole lot of those in the New Testament. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. I loved this section because it divides our hope into two different sections that I find that in myself and in a lot of our friend groups that I've talked with, uh, people tend to focus on one half of this hope without really prioritizing the other. And I think it's worth trying to balance those out and making sure that we keep both of them in scope. And the first half of that hope is that we've been given new birth into a living hope, which is here and now. That's what keeps us going from day to day. That's what gives us strength and power. And that is through the resurrection of Jesus. The second half of this is the inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. And it says this inheritance is kept in heaven for you. And so this is the eternal side of it. So we have both of these where it's not just, I think sometimes people, maybe people within Christianity, hopefully not, but a lot of people outside of it think that Christianity is all about just doing the right things or saying the right prayer in order to get your ticket to heaven punched. And that is not the full story. And that's obviously a kind of a gross misrepresentation of it too. But it's not just about heaven for the future, for eternity. It's also about the here and now. And sometimes as believers, we focus so much on the here and now of that living hope that we have right now that we sometimes forget about the eternal side of it. And it can really help to keep both sides of those into perspective so that it keeps everything that you're doing now in an eternal perspective, and everything that you long and hope for eternally, you think about what does that affect, how does that affect my day to day? And so I don't know, I was just reading through this and thought that that might be encouraging for you if you find that you tend to focus on one of those or another. I tend to personally think a lot about the here and now and the practical day to day. Books like First Peter are super they resonate a lot with me because it's very practical. It's very do this, don't do this, focus on this, don't worry about this, and I tend to not think so much about the eternal side of it. And so this is a great call to action for me to think about the long lasting effects of what we're doing here and now. All right, today's topic. Let's talk about some nutrition terms that you should know. Uh, the background of this episode is that there are a lot of nutrition terms, phrases, concepts, things like that that get thrown around on social media or even just on packaging for your foods and your ingredients that you have in your pantry and your fridge and places like that. There are so many confusing terminology and everything that gets put onto these labels that as I started to look more into them recently, I started thinking this isn't really common knowledge. And I don't really know that there are a lot of great places for people to go that are going to be helpful in dispelling some of the myths that are around some of these terms and just clearly and plainly labeling, what do these different terms mean? What do these different phrases and concepts refer to? And so I just put together a short list of food items, and nutrition terms that I thought would be helpful for you to know. And you'll find these on nutrition labels on your foods. You'll find these on social media and talking about dieting. You'll find these kind of all over the place. And if you've ever felt confused by those, I hope that this episode really kind of clears things up for you. So I just have a list here that's organized alphabetically, and we're kicking things off with the term added sugars. And this is something that tends to incite a lot of fear, where people will see added sugars on a nutrition label and they go, "Oh no, I can't buy that. I need a version that is that doesn't have that on that, or is sugar free, or very clearly labeled sugar free or whatever." And added sugars is not something to be afraid of. And even if it's something that you and your doctor have had conversations about this as something that you do need to limit or to avoid, you still don't need to be afraid of it. I think that education is helpful in relieving the fear side of it, because then you can make an educated choice of what's for you, what's not. So added sugars, when you see that, that's going to be listed under the carbohydrate section on nutrition labels, and it literally just means that sugar has been added as an ingredient to whatever that food item is, or a version of sugar. This doesn't affect the macros or the carb count in it differently than it would be if there was natural, quote, natural sugars. We're going to talk about that term next. If it's not going to affect it differently, and your body's going to react very similarly as if it was natural sugars, just like with foods like fruits and vegetables, where you might have some natural sugars that are found in there, as opposed to having been added to sugar, or sugar added to it. So this is not something to be afraid of, and just pay attention to that the next time that you see a nutrition label. See if there's an added sugars section. It can be interesting, and you might find that a lot of foods, even foods that you wouldn't suspect, do have a lot of added sugars to them. And if that's something that is on your radar in terms of your overall health, then you can definitely keep an eye on that. Again, you don't have to be afraid of it. But from the fitness perspective that we're talking about, with things like body composition and fat loss, that is not going to be one of the big things that you need to be worrying about. And so that's our first term. Next up on the list, as I mentioned, is natural, or all natural. This is going to be the first of many terms on this list that I'm going to tell you it doesn't mean anything specific, and therefore it doesn't mean anything useful. These are just marketing terms that make your foods look more appealing. They makes them look healthier. Even terms like healthy, that's not on my list here, but that doesn't mean anything specific. It's not a regulated term, and so you can throw any of those kinds of terms onto packages for foods that you're trying to market to a specific audience, or trying to convince them to buy your product versus another, and you go, "Oh, yeah, that doesn't really mean anything," and it's not specific, it's not regulated. And so terms like all natural and natural, and go into your pantry, go into your fridge, and see if you can find these terms on anything that you have. I found it on 4 or 5 different foods in our pantry, especially like peanut butter, where you'll see that all natural. It's all labeled in big old letters on there, and that really doesn't help you a whole lot. And especially, again, from a fitness and body composition side of things, you don't have to worry about that. That's not very helpful. Next up is the term calorie. So if you're listening to this, you have likely been made aware of calories in one way or another, whether it's in a neutral way, which is how I'm going to try to sway you here, or maybe you've been exposed to it in a negative or fear-inducing way, where you see calories and you get afraid of looking at the calorie counts on foods, or you automatically think of dieting and going into a calorie deficit, and some of those terms that get blasted on social media without a whole lot of context. I'm going to help dispel that for you. Ready? Calories are simply a unit of energy. This brings me back to my college classes, where we would be looking at thermodynamics within the body, and we would talk all the time about calories and kilocalories and joules and all that kind of stuff, if you're familiar with that whole world. And this is just one of the ways that we categorized energy, energy intake, energy expenditure, energy use. So just like, we I talk a lot about financial analogies when it comes to calories, and calories in, calories out, talking about budgeting, things like that. I've talked about that in previous episodes. And just like how you might have a quantity of money in the bank, and you might quantify that in dollars, you can also quantify energy that's found within food items in calories. So if you had $500 in the bank, that might be analogous to 500 calories worth of energy in a food item. So it's not something that needs to be fear inducing. And I know that it's a lot easier said than done, to just, you can't just decide, "Oh, I'm not going to be afraid of that anymore." But when you think about it in terms of energy, and you think about it in terms of the fitness side of it, of energy expenditure on the other side of that equation, that we're talking about energy in and energy out. Just like if you were driving a car, you put gas in and you expend energy to be able to drive. And it's just this constant give and take that is ongoing, and you are going to be taking advantage of that regarding your goals and whatever your goals are. And so you can pay attention to that as much or as little as you need to for your goals, but you don't have to worry about it. That's what I'm trying to help you with in this episode is you don't have to worry about a lot of these things. Even if these are legitimate terms that are important, worry and fear are not emotions that I would hope that you don't associate with these terms any longer after this here. So calories are just a unit of energy. Next up is clean or clean eating. This is one of my favorite terms to hate on. Clean, again, it does not mean anything specific. It's not regulated. You might have some very strong opinions about this phrase of clean eating or clean. You might see this on cookbooks. You might see this on dieting blogs. You might see this on social media. You might see this on like diets, like diet programs, the idea of, oh, this is a clean diet, or oh, I do clean eating 90% of the time. People tend to have very specific ideas of what this means. And a lot of times it's referring to you're just eating mostly whole foods that don't have additives to it. But it's still just a marketing term. It's not regulated. There's no way to really decide what is clean and what isn't. A lot of people will probably argue with me on that from an opinion and subjective point of view, but objectively, this does not mean anything useful. And so, if you find that you see this term a lot, or I would challenge you, if you find that you use this term a lot of clean or clean eating to describe your own eating or to describe how somebody else eats, I would recommend to try to kind of phase that out of your terminology because it doesn't mean anything, and it can be a little bit of a almost like a virtue signaling sort of scenario where think about what clean represents in general and how the opposite of that would be dirty. Most people are probably not going to be bragging about eating dirty, and I don't really know what that would mean outside of like dirty bulking, but that's still, even that term kind of has a little bit of a negative connotation to it, and clean just sounds like, oh yeah, you've figured it out and this is the way to do it. And that is not helpful. And in fact, this can even lead down the road to something called orthorexia, and that is this kind of this disorder of focusing so much on clean eating that you have totally categorized what foods are in and what foods are out. And that out category, those would be the dirty foods, and that can really be a challenging way to look at food. And so clean and clean eating, I would phase that out if you find that you're using that a whole lot, or if you're following people on social media that are constantly harping on about clean eating, might be worth unfollowing them at that point. Next up is the term electrolyte. This is another term, just like calories, where you're probably super familiar with this in a sense, on a surface level of going, yeah, I've heard of electrolytes, and you might immediately think of things like Gatorade. But do you know what electrolytes are? Do you know what they do? Electrolytes are substances that regulate chemical reactions within the body, and a lot of that has to do with fluid balance within and outside of your cells. Electrolytes, as the base, as the root of that word might suggest, they are electrically charged, and that's going to be a big part of muscular contraction as far as how our conversation is going about in terms of fitness. If you were to take a look at how your muscles actually contract, this again bringing me back to my college days and all this here, but if you take a look at the term that's coming to mind is sarcomeres. You familiar with that? If that rings a bell in your head, you're my kind of person because we'll talk anatomy and phys all day long. But anyway, back to electrolytes here. When you are performing any kind of muscular contraction, that is a an electric signal. There's an electric signal that gets potentiated throughout your muscle, and this is going to have to do with electrolytes, and the presence or absence of electrolytes is going to drastically affect how that muscle contracts, if it contracts, how long it can contract, how hard it can contract, all of those kinds of things. When we look at electrolytes, again, you might think of things like Gatorade. If you look at a Gatorade label, you will see that they are probably going to be pretty heavily advertising that it contains electrolytes like sodium and potassium. Those are two of the big ones that your body needs. Those are both going to be positively charged electrolytes. Some other positively charged electrolytes are magnesium and calcium. On the negative side of things, you have chloride, phosphate, and bicarbonate. Those are going to be some of the bigger ones that you'll see in larger quantities, either within the body or within some of the food products that you might be eating or drinking as well. Next up is intermittent fasting. This is another one that I love to hate on, and let's talk about this. Intermittent fasting. When you hear that term, do you have any associations with that? Do you think about the keto diet, for example? We're going to talk about that next, but maybe you think about it with the keto diet. Maybe you think about it with CrossFit. Those are kind of all linked implicitly because of a lot of what the CrossFit community has done over the years, but they're not actually specifically related. They don't have to be related. And so, again, I kind of want to help you uh, disassociate some of these things with one another and with the emotional side of it as well too. Intermittent fasting, you might hear this called time restricted fasting or time restricted feeding, and this is the idea of that you're only eating within a certain time frame each day. The most common example of this would be called 16-8 intermittent fasting. You might also hear this called just IF or IF. 16-8 intermittent fasting is where you fast for 16 hours, where you're not intaking any sort of food or calories. And then you do that for 16 hours, and then you have an 8-hour feeding window or eating window. And that's where between those 8 hours, that's when you fit all of your meals in for the day. This is something where that is the most common scenario is that 16-8, but intermittent fasting is not specifically bound to that. You could do something, you could do 14-10, you could do 12-12, you could do 10-14, you could even do 8-16, which if you think about sleeping 8 hours a night and maybe you eat first thing in the morning and then you eat last thing before you go to bed, that would be like an 8-16. You could call that 8-16 intermittent fasting. So technically, I would argue that we all intermittent fast to one degree or another. And so that I hope debunks a little bit of this idea that intermittent fasting is somehow superior to other ways of eating because we either all do it or none of us do it, and of course some people are more strict on it about how they do it, and their feeding window is sometimes it's even like like a 20-4 where they fast for 20 hours and they only eat within that 4-hour window. There can be some benefits for intermittent fasting, but it is not inherently superior for anything that you're doing, and so you tend to see a lot of people who do intermittent fasting that will brag about it. And again, this is it ends up kind of being a little bit of a virtue signaling kind of scenario where people tend to talk about how much better it is than those days where they used to just eat like the rest of us, and they used to do. Eating first thing in the morning and then eating last thing at night and everything in between. That is not. That's Don't worry about that. If that's you, that's me. I'll say that readily here. And if that's you, I wouldn't worry about that either. So intermittent fasting is just time restricted feeding, and this can be a great tool. I'll say that it's not superior, but it can be a great tool in your fitness toolbox, especially for things like fat loss and creating a calorie deficit. Because if you are eating within less time, within a smaller time frame during each day, you are likely going to be either skipping your first meal or skipping your last meal, or just physically trying to cram all of your calories within a smaller time period. And you might just feel more full during that time period. And you might therefore end up eating less or eating not as much as you normally would if you're trying to create a calorie deficit or trying to eat less in that regard. So that's just something to think about. Again, not superior. Next up, as I alluded to, ketosis. Ketosis is simply the state in which your body is using fat for fuel. It's preferentially using fat for fuel instead of carbs, which is reverse of how your body typically works if you're not trying to actively achieve a state of ketosis. When you are restricting your carbs, your body is going to adapt to creating and using ketones within your body, which come from fat. Come from your body fat and come from your dietary fat, and it's going to use that for fuel. The keto diet is inextricably linked to ketosis and the idea of getting into ketosis. The keto diet is typically going to be a diet that consists of 70 to 80% fat, and this is by caloric intake. 70 to 80% fat, 10 to 20% protein, and 5 to 10% carbs. So this is high fat, moderate protein, low carbs. And it can be within those ranges. And the idea of when you are eating such low amounts of carbohydrates that and such high amounts of dietary fat, that your body is going to have to adjust how it normally works to create and use energy. And so, this idea of ketosis, again, this is not a matter of superiority. This is a matter of depending on what your goals are and depending on how many myths and lies you've bought into. For example, you might see a lot of people that find a lot of success on the keto diet from a fat loss point of view within the first couple of weeks. But then you track them in the long term and you realize that they may not be as overly productive as you have thought in terms of progress. I'll just say it that way. This is not something that you need to try to strive for if you don't like eating that much dietary fat, or if you just love eating more than 5 to 10% of your daily calorie intake from carbs. You don't have to switch to the keto diet in order to reach a state of ketosis in order to think that you are going to make progress from that. So the ketosis is just when your body is using fat for fuel instead of carbs, and this brings on a whole slew of potential issues depending on how you go about doing this. The keto diet is probably not best if you're just eating like bacon and butter. There are better ways of doing that that are going to be a little bit more sustainable, but sustainability is one of those things that a lot of people struggle with unless they find a particular really regimented kind of strict process for figuring out which foods they're going to eat on the keto diet. Speaking of fat, protein, and carbs, next up, we're talking about macros. So, again, if you're listening to this, you've likely heard the term macros, but maybe you haven't thought too much further about what that looks like. Maybe you know that there are three of them. Maybe you know that there are three macronutrients. Maybe you know that that macros is short for macronutrients, and there are three of them: protein, carbs, and fats. Let's talk just a little bit more about those. So, protein, carbs, and fats, those are going to be the main constituents, the macronutrients, if you will, that are going to make up all of the food items that you intake, as far as the energy that comes from them, as far as the calories that comes from them. And so protein, carbs, and fats, we can quantify this. So from an energy point of view, every gram of protein is going to have 4 calories per gram. Every gram of carbohydrate is going to also contain 4 calories, and every gram of fat is going to contain 9 calories. And so every gram of fat is going to contain a little bit more than 2 times the amount of energy that protein and carbs have. From this, you can, and this isn't always super helpful because of nutrition labels and how they work now, but you can reverse engineer the calorie content of a food item if the macros are known. So if you see a food item, let's say peanut butter, for example, and you know that it has X number of grams of protein, X number of grams of carbs, and X number of grams of fat, you can do the multiplication on this. You can multiply the grams of protein and carbs by 4, and then multiply the grams of fat by 9, and you can derive the number of calories that are going to be within that serving. You might notice that sometimes it's going to be off by a little bit. So if you see a serving size that it says 2 tablespoons of peanut butter is 180 calories, and you do the reverse engineering macros math, and you see that that math only gets you to, I don't know, 176 calories. You might think, hey, why is that not exactly the same? And that comes down to a couple things, not the least of them being the fact that this 449 calories per gram model is not quite exact, and it is plenty accurate enough for all of us who are you listening to this, me talking about this, it is plenty exact enough to be able to reach your goals. You don't need to go beyond this. But the 449 are actually it's closer to something like 4.1 and 4.3 and 9.1, things like that. So that does add up when you add in enough of that. But that is not worth worrying about. This is a much easier model to be able to go off of. So macros are very useful in a lot of ways. Protein, from a fitness and body composition point of view, is going to be the one that you're probably going to want to focus the most on. We talk about protein a lot, and it's become somewhat of a meme in the fitness community of always talking about protein, protein, protein. But that's one of the scenarios where there's actually a reason for that. And protein, no matter who you are, is worth focusing on as far as something that is probably worth intentionally consuming sufficiently. A lot of people, depending on how you prefer to eat, a lot of people will not just naturally eat sufficient amounts of protein for their goals, whether it's just pure health and maintenance of where your health and strength is at, or if it's something of body composition related of building muscle or losing body fat, protein is going to be something that's worth focusing on there. Next up is metabolism. This is going to be, simply put, the total sum of all the chemical reactions that take place in the body. And metabolism is something that a lot of people think of, oh, as I've gotten older, my metabolism has really slowed down. And this is where I would challenge that and go, do you know how that works, and do you know how much it's slowed down? And what metrics are you using to measure the rate of your metabolism? Because in the fitness world, metabolism is the total sum of the energy that's used within your body as a whole. It's not just digestion. It's not just related to fat storage. And so you think about the total sum of energy used within the body. It takes energy to fidget your fingers, to blink your eyes, to wiggle your nose. It takes energy to do all of those kinds of things, and those are obviously very small, but all of that does add up. And your total daily energy expenditure, which is your amount of energy expenditure that you are using just by existing, not anything that's related to your extra activity or your workouts or anything like that. That is going to be a pretty significant amount of how much energy you actually expend on a regular basis, including your movement, including your workouts. And so this talk about metabolism. Metabolism does not slow with age nearly as fast as people suppose. It's actually pretty stable from about 20 years old to 60 years old. And then after that, it tends to decline about 1% or so per year after that. So a 1% per year decline is not something to scoff at. That will add up over 10, 15, 20 years. But think about people who are within that range of maybe you're 35, 40, 45 years old, and you're thinking, "Oh, my metabolism, it just has slowed down since I was 20." It's like, actually, it's been probably pretty stable since about 20 years old. And so a lot of the times when people experience this, what they're actually experiencing is that they have been consuming more calories over time, and they have been moving less. They've been using and expending fewer calories over time than they used to. For a lot of people, they were much, much more active when they were 20 years old than they are at 40 or 50 or 60 years old. And so that makes a big difference. Even if your body isn't changing as much, your activity and your lifestyle has changed to where everything has slowed down. Maybe you're maintaining lower levels of muscle mass because you just haven't been using it or challenging your body in that way. And so that's why we talk about strength training as being such an important thing for people of any age, especially within that kind of age range there too. So just something to think about the next time that you find yourself saying something about your metabolism slowing, is that it's probably not slowing at the rate that you think it is. Next up is organic. This is a misnomer in a sense, because a lot of times people will say that organic foods, or they believe that organic foods are not treated with things like pesticides and herbicides and things like that. When in reality, organic is simply a designation for foods that have been treated with pesticides, with herbicides, with fungicides that the USDA deems to be safe for human consumption. And so this is something that, again, virtue signaling is something that I don't want to be the theme of this here, but a lot of times these foods or these terms get thrown out on foods and food items for the sake of trying to make you believe that those are going to be better choices. When in reality, a lot of these terms, especially with things like organic foods, they might not be readily available for a lot of people, whether it's financially, whether it's just the fact that they aren't available. A lot of people are not going to be buying organic foods for all of their foods, for all of their produce, for all of their meats, things like that. And so you have to think, okay, this is more specific than some of the other terms, but is it actually helpful? Is it useful? And I would argue in some cases it can be. It's good to know these things, but again, we don't have to be afraid of it, and you don't have to think, "Oh, if I can't buy, for whatever reason, if I can't buy organic produce, then I should just not eat fruits and vegetables at all." And that's some of the messaging that gets thrown around out there. And so I would recommend to not worry about that here. But from the educational side of it, I will share something that you can look up on your own if you are curious about this here. But there's a list that gets put out each year, and it's called and coined the Dirty Dozen versus the Clean 15. And the Dirty Dozen is a dozen foods that are maybe a bigger difference in the organic versus the non-organic versions, based off of the different pesticides and things that are used on them. This list often includes strawberries, spinach, kale, and other greens, apples, grapes, things like that. And so these are some that are often deemed as, hey, if you can, get these organic. I'm not saying that you have to. We don't get most of those organic. We do get organic strawberries because they tend to last longer. We get them from Costco, and we've done that side by side testing. But the second half of that is the clean 15, and these are the ones that are maybe not such a big deal, not such a big difference between the organic and non-organic versions. And those are going to be things like avocados, sweet corn, pineapple, onions, papaya, things like that. You can look those lists up for yourself. But those are maybe worth checking into just if you want some education on that there too. All right, my friends, I have a few more items on this list that I'm not going to get to today. Maybe I'll do a part two for you. And if that's something you want to see, you let me know. But I'll leave you with that. As always, for this episode, if you enjoyed it before we end recording here, go ahead and take a screenshot of your phone of you listening to this on your favorite podcast app and post it to your favorite social media app and tag me, and I'll be sure to repost you as well too. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. I'm Coach Jay. Thanks for hanging with me, and we'll see you next time.